August 25th, 1944. Somewhere on a dusty road in northern France. The engine roars. The steering wheel vibrates in hands that have not rested in 20 hours. Behind the wheel sits a young black American soldier, barely 20 years old, pushing a 2.5-ton truck loaded with 5 tons of ammunition down a road he has never seen before. His eyes burn from exhaustion. His back aches from the constant jolting over shell craters and debris. Sweat drips down his face in the summer heat, but he does not stop. He cannot stop. Because 400 miles ahead, American tanks sit motionless in the fields of France, their fuel tanks bone dry, their guns silent, their crews waiting for him to arrive. In the passenger seat, another soldier fights to stay awake, ready to take over the moment his partner begins to drift. They have been trading places like this for 2 days straight. Behind them stretches an endless ribbon of headlights. Hundreds of trucks moving through the darkness like a river of steel and determination. Red ball emblems painted on their bumpers glow in the dim light. Red ball signs mark every intersection along the route. And inside every cab, men who have been told their entire lives that they are not good enough to fight, not smart enough to lead, not worthy of equality, are now doing the one thing that might actually win this war. This is the story of the Red Ball Express, the largest and most intensive truck convoy operation in military history. An 82-day emergency lifeline that delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies across France and kept the Allied advance alive when it threatened to collapse from its own success. Approximately 75% of its drivers were African-American soldiers serving in a rigidly segregated army. They fought a war for freedom abroad while being denied that same freedom at home. Without them, the liberation of Western Europe would have ground to a halt. Tanks would have sat empty in fields. Artillery would have fallen silent. The German army might have regrouped, counterattacked, and changed the course of history. And yet, for more than half a century, their story was barely told. The Red Ball Express was born from desperation. To understand why it was needed, you must first understand what happened in the weeks after D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 150,000 troops came ashore on that first day. It was the beginning of the liberation of Europe, but what followed was not the rapid advance that planners had hoped for. Instead, American, British, and Canadian troops found themselves trapped in the Norman hedgerows for 7 grueling weeks, confined to a beachhead just 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The ancient hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything the American army had trained to fight through. These were not mere bushes or fences. They were thick, earthen walls, some of them hundreds of years old, topped with dense vegetation that turned every field into a natural fortress. German defenders used them masterfully. A handful of enemy soldiers with machine guns could hold an entire hedgerow line against a company of attacking Americans. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Every field had to be taken separately, casualties mounted with terrible speed. Some American units lost half their men in the first weeks of fighting. Then, on July 25, 1944, everything changed. Operation Cobra punched through German lines near St. Lo. Massive aerial bombardment shattered German defenses. American forces poured through the gap. The breakout became a sprint. General George S. Patton's Third Army charged across France with a ferocity that stunned friend and enemy alike. His tanks often covered more than 80 miles in a single week. Paris, which Allied commanders had not expected to fall until autumn, was liberated on August 25th, the same day the Red Ball Express began its operations. But the very speed that made the advance so spectacular created a catastrophe that threatened to end it just as suddenly. The Allied armies had outrun their supply lines by hundreds of miles, and the logistical infrastructure to sustain them simply did not exist. Before D-Day, Allied bombers had systematically destroyed the French rail network to prevent German reinforcement of the Normandy defences. That strategic decision had worked brilliantly for the invasion. German troops and supplies had been unable to reach the front quickly, but that same destruction now crippled Allied logistics. The railroads that should have been carrying supplies to the front lay in twisted ruins across the French countryside. Bridges were down. Marshalling yards had been cratered. Locomotives had been destroyed. The major channel ports that should have been receiving supply ships were either still in German hands or destroyed. Calais, Le Havre, Brest, and Dunkirk remained under German control or had been demolished. Cherbourg had been captured in late June, but the Germans had destroyed its facilities before surrendering. They had sunk ships in the harbour, destroyed cranes, and mined the docks. It would take months to restore it. This meant that virtually all supplies for the Allied armies were still stockpiled on Normandy beaches, beside roads, and around villages far behind the rapidly advancing front. There were 28 Allied divisions in the field by late August. Each division consumed roughly 750 tons of supplies per day, food for thousands of hungry soldiers, ammunition for their rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces, medical supplies for the wounded, spare parts for their vehicles, and above all, fuel. That meant approximately 21,000 tons of supplies needed to reach the front lines every single day just to keep the armies fed, armed, and moving. The fuel consumption was particularly staggering. The First and Third Armies together burned through 800,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. An armoured division in active combat could consume 350,000 gallons in a single day of operations. Patton's tanks were thirsty beasts. A Sherman tank got less than 1 mile per gallon of fuel. The farther the armies advanced from Normandy, the more fuel they needed just to transport fuel to themselves. It was a logistical nightmare that grew worse with every mile of progress. By late August, Patton's tanks were grinding to a halt. Not from enemy fire, not from mechanical failure, from empty fuel tanks. On August 31st, his daily fuel allocation plummeted from 400,000 gallons to just 31,000 gallons. It was not enough to move a single armoured division more than a few miles. The most aggressive army in the European theatre was effectively frozen in place just as victory seemed within reach. German forces were in full retreat, their army shattered, their morale collapsing. But without fuel, Patton could not pursue them. Every day of delay gave the enemy time to regroup, dig new defensive positions, and bring up reinforcements. Patton was furious. He reportedly told Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. He raged against the supply situation, blamed his rival British General Bernard Montgomery for taking more than his share of resources, and demanded that something be done immediately. The Allied advance that had seemed unstoppable just days before now faced the very real possibility of stalling completely. If the Germans were given enough time to establish a new defensive line, the war might drag on for months or even years longer. The window of opportunity to end the war quickly was closing. In a 36-hour emergency brainstorming session at Allied headquarters, American commanders devised a radical solution. They would turn the highways of France into a one-way conveyor belt of trucks. No railroads, no pipelines, no time to build new infrastructure, just thousands of trucks running day and night without stopping, hauling supplies from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines hundreds of miles away. It was an improvised solution born of desperation, but it was the only option available. Brigadier General Ewart G. Plank, who would implement the system, declared that it should never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans could not. The name Red Ball came from American railroad terminology. Since roughly 1892, railroads had marked priority express freight with red balls or dots painted on the sides of train cars. When a red ball train was coming, the tracks were cleared and all other traffic moved aside. An earlier Red Ball Express had operated in Britain before D-Day, rushing supplies to English ports for the invasion. The 1944 operation in France was effectively the second Red Ball Express, but it would become the one that history remembered. The system was elegantly simple in concept and brutally demanding in execution. 2 parallel one-way highways were created across northern France. The northern route carried loaded trucks heading east toward the front. The southern route carried empty trucks returning west to reload. All civilian traffic was banned from these roads. Local military vehicles unrelated to the Red Ball Express were strictly forbidden from using them. French-language posters warned civilians to stay off Red Ball routes. Farmers had to find alternate paths to their fields. Villages along the route simply had to accept the endless river of trucks rumbling past their homes at all hours of the day and night. Military police from the 783rd Military Police Battalion and other units stationed themselves at intersections around the clock. Their job was to direct traffic, enforce the rules, keep the convoys moving, and prevent anyone from blocking or slowing the trucks. Over 25,000 road signs were posted along the routes, featuring large red ball emblems that could be seen even in poor visibility. The signs also displayed daily tonnage targets to motivate drivers and show them what they were accomplishing. The initial route ran from staging areas near St. Lo, where supplies arrived from Cherbourg, Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, and the Mulberry Artificial Harbor at Arromanches. From there, trucks drove east through the French countryside to a supply depot triangle around Chartres, La Loupe, and Dreux, just west of Paris. The one-way distance was roughly 125 miles, with the total round-trip loop spanning approximately 300 miles. Drivers would load their trucks at the Normandy depots, drive all day and night to the forward supply points, unload their cargo, and immediately turn around to do it all again. As the front advanced, the route extended dramatically. A First Army branch pushed northeast from Versailles to Soissons in early September, and eventually all the way to Hirson on the Franco-Belgian border by September 20th. A Third Army branch extended east towards Sommezes, Verdun, and eventually Metz. At maximum extent, the round trip stretched to 750 miles for First Army supply runs and 670 miles for Third Army runs. The town of Alencon served as a critical midpoint where drivers could stop to refuel their trucks, grab a few minutes of rest, eat a hot meal if one was available, and perform emergency maintenance on their vehicles before continuing the journey. Official convoy rules specified a minimum of 5 trucks per group, escorted by jeeps at the front and rear, maintaining 60-yard intervals between vehicles at a maximum speed limit of 25 miles per hour. Drivers were supposed to take 10-minute breaks at precisely 10 minutes before each even hour, and a 30-minute food break every 6 hours. These regulations looked good on paper and would have made the operation safer and more sustainable. In practice, almost every one of them was widely ignored. The pressure to deliver supplies was simply too intense for anyone to follow peacetime safety rules. Drivers and mechanics removed the engine governors that capped truck speed at 56 miles per hour. Without those governors, trucks routinely traveled at 60 miles per hour or even faster on straight stretches of road. Individual trucks often departed Cherbourg the moment they were loaded, rather than waiting for convoys to form. Why wait an hour for 4 more trucks when the front needed supplies right now? Military police who tried to enforce the rules were cursed at and ignored. The drivers had their orders, and those orders said to deliver supplies as fast as possible. A popular saying among the drivers captured the culture of the operation perfectly. Red Ball trucks break, but they do not break. The drivers adopted the French phrase tout de suite, meaning immediately or right now, as their unofficial motto. The workhorse of the Red Ball Express was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo truck, universally known as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. Rated to carry 2.5 tons, these rugged 6-wheel drive vehicles were routinely overloaded to 5 tons or more. Over 560,000 CCKWs were manufactured during the war, part of more than 800,000 2.5-ton trucks produced by all manufacturers combined. The fleet also included Dodge trucks, 5-ton cargo trucks, and Diamond T semi-trailers. The Red Ball fleet peaked at 5,958 vehicles by the 4th day, organized into 132 truck companies. Over the operation's life, more than 6,000 trucks and trailers participated. Approximately 900 vehicles were on the road at any given moment, moving in roughly 140 daily convoys. The operation employed approximately 23,000 truck drivers and cargo loaders. 2 drivers were typically assigned to each truck for the longest hauls, trading off behind the wheel. Many of these drivers had never operated a truck before joining the army. Some had never even driven a car. Most were under the age of 24. They received basic training in vehicle operation and then were sent to France to drive routes they had never seen, in vehicles they were still learning to handle, under conditions that would have challenged the most experienced truckers in the world. As the operation scaled up and demand increased, soldiers from non-critical duties were pulled from their regular assignments, given abbreviated training, and pressed into service as Red Ball drivers. Port battalion personnel, supply depot workers, anyone who could learn to operate a truck was put behind the wheel. And now we come to the part of this story that was hidden from history for decades. The men behind the wheels. Approximately 73 to 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American, They served in segregated, all-black units commanded overwhelmingly by white officers. Many of those white officers were Southerners who brought their regional prejudices with them to the war. By November 1944, 210,000 African Americans were serving in the European theatre, with over 93,000 assigned to the Quartermaster Corps that ran the supply operations. These men served in units whose numerical designations tell a story of their own: the 3,214th Quartermaster Service Company, the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, the 3,989th Motor Transport Company, the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, the 3,715th Quartermaster Truck Company. Dozens of other units whose names have largely been forgotten by history. Their roles extended far beyond driving. They served as automotive mechanics, who kept the trucks running through impossible conditions, cannibalizing parts from broken vehicles to repair others. They worked as loading crews, known as humpers, who loaded and unloaded tons of ammunition, food, and fuel at both ends of the route, often by hand. They served as military police, directing traffic at intersections throughout the night. They worked as truck dispatchers, coordinating convoy movements across hundreds of miles. 3/4 of the stevedores unloading ships at French ports were black soldiers. The United States Army was fully and officially racially segregated during World War II. This was not informal prejudice, but official policy enforced throughout the military hierarchy. Black soldiers were confined to separate blood banks, hospital wards, barracks, mess halls, and recreational facilities. They were almost exclusively assigned to service and support roles based on the military's stated belief that African Americans lacked the intelligence and courage for combat. African Americans comprised just over 10% of the Army, but made up nearly 21% of service units. Of 106 Army training courses, only 21 accepted black soldiers. Black officers were barred from officers' clubs and routinely denied salutes by white enlisted men. The irony of this situation was devastating and obvious to anyone willing to see it. The world's greatest democracy was fighting the world's greatest racist regime with a segregated army. American propaganda proclaimed that the nation stood for freedom and equality against Nazi tyranny, while black American soldiers experienced systematic discrimination every day of their service. German prisoners of war held in camps across America were sometimes treated better than the black American soldiers who guarded them. The German prisoners were allowed to eat in the same dining halls as white Americans, attend the same movie theaters, and ride in the same train cars from which black soldiers in American uniforms were legally barred. This contradiction burned deeply in the hearts of black servicemen and their families. The outrage over this hypocrisy fueled what became known as the Double V campaign. Launched on February 7, 1942, by the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in America, the campaign began with a letter from a 26-year-old defense worker named James G. Thompson. He asked simply whether he should sacrifice his life to live as only half an American. The Double V demanded victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Black Americans would fight for their country, but they would not forget what their country owed them in return. The conditions on the Red Ball Highway were brutal beyond what any official plan had anticipated. Drivers routinely worked 20 or more consecutive hours without rest. Some pushed through 36 to 48 hours without any sleep at all. A complete round trip averaged approximately 54 hours depending on which army was being supplied, and drivers were expected to turn around and start another run almost immediately upon returning. When trucks began zigzagging from driver fatigue, men would stop briefly, splash cold water on their faces from their canteens, slap themselves to stay awake, and drive on. Two-man crews learned to switch seats while the truck was still moving down the road. If the exchange was done right, a foot was always on the gas pedal, and the truck never stopped. One driver recalled decades later that it was awful. Sometimes he felt like screaming just to stay awake. The monotony of the road, combined with crushing exhaustion, created a kind of waking nightmare. Some desperate soldiers sabotaged their own vehicles, draining oil or loosening parts, to create an excuse to stop and rest while waiting for repairs. Others deliberately got lost near French villages so they could pull over and sleep for a few hours before finding their way back to the route the next day. Officers knew this was happening but often looked the other way because they understood that their men were being pushed past the limits of human endurance. Night driving was particularly terrifying. West of the Seine River, Where the area had been firmly in Allied hands for weeks, drivers were permitted to use full headlights. But as the route extended east into areas closer to enemy lines, or where German aircraft might still appear, drivers had to rely on what were called cat eyes. These were special blackout headlights that cast a dim beam directly onto the road surface, illuminating only a few feet ahead of the vehicle. They were designed to make trucks invisible from the air, but they also made the road nearly invisible to the drivers themselves. On narrow, unfamiliar French roads littered with debris from weeks of combat, every mile driven at night was a gamble with death. At night, the road ahead was visible only as specks of white and red light from the cat eyes of hundreds of other trucks, stretching into the darkness ahead and behind. Drivers followed those lights, trusting that the truck ahead knew where it was going. If the lead truck made a wrong turn or drove off the road, the trucks behind might follow before anyone realized the mistake. The exhaustion was so profound that drivers sometimes hallucinated. They saw things that were not there. They fell asleep with their eyes open. They woke up to find they had been driving for miles with no memory of the road they had covered. The hazards on Red Bull routes were relentless and deadly. Landmines planted by retreating German forces had not all been cleared from roads and roadsides. Drivers were ordered to steer down the center of roads that engineers had not yet declared safe. Sandbags were packed on truck floors beneath the seats in hopes of absorbing some of the blast if a mine exploded under the vehicle. It was cold comfort at best. French roads were littered with sharp objects that destroyed tires at an appalling rate. Discarded C-ration cans with their ragged metal edges sliced through rubber. Shrapnel from artillery shells and aerial bombs lay scattered across the pavement. Barbed wire from destroyed defensive positions wrapped around wheels and axles. Rubble from Allied bombing of German positions had to be navigated around or driven over. Mud was the most destructive natural enemy the drivers faced. The narrow 11-inch truck wheels were easily overwhelmed by the thick, clinging mud that the autumn rains produced across the French countryside. Trucks that left the road surface even slightly could become hopelessly mired. Attempts to power through only dug the wheels deeper and burned out transmissions. Even after a truck was freed, dried mud could lock brakes solid, requiring hours of work to clean. The narrow French roads, never designed for heavy military traffic, deteriorated rapidly under the relentless pounding of thousands of trucks. Potholes appeared overnight. Road surfaces crumbled into dust or dissolved into mud depending on the weather. Enemy threats persisted throughout the operation, despite the general air superiority Allied forces enjoyed by late 1944. The German Luftwaffe, though badly weakened, still occasionally sent fighters and attack aircraft to strafe supply convoys when opportunities arose. Drivers learned to listen for the sound of approaching aircraft and were trained to leap from their cabs into roadside ditches at the first sign of an attack. Some never made it out in time. Bypassed German soldiers who had been cut off during the rapid Allied advance lurked in the French countryside. Small groups of enemy troops, sometimes desperate and sometimes simply lost, ambushed supply convoys or took shots at passing trucks from concealed positions. Snipers claimed victims along certain stretches of the route. German prisoners of war who had been put to work at fuel depots were caught deliberately contaminating gasoline with water or sugar, hoping to disable Allied vehicles. Security at supply points had to be increased. Some convoys mounted 50-caliber machine guns on makeshift gun trucks for protection against both enemy soldiers and thieves. Soldiers carried carbines in their cabs. The threat of hijacking came not only from the enemy, but from Allied units and French black marketeers alike. A 5-gallon jerrycan of gasoline fetched $100 on the French black market, a fortune at the time. Desperate American units whose own supplies had not arrived sometimes stopped Red Bull trucks at gunpoint and took what they needed. Truck drivers learned to be suspicious of anyone trying to flag them down. Mechanical breakdown was constant and relentless. The trucks were being used far beyond their designed limits. Batteries dried up from constant vibration. Engines overheated on long runs. Motors burned out for lack of proper lubrication. Transmissions were overstressed by heavy loads and night driving on difficult roads. Bolts vibrated loose. Drive shafts dropped onto the pavement, bringing trucks to sudden stops. Approximately 1,500 vehicles required repair or recovery every single day. The majority were from wrecks and accidents caused by exhausted drivers who fell asleep at the wheel or misjudged curves on unfamiliar roads. In the first month alone, 40,000 tires were worn out and replaced. In September, that number rose to over 55,000. The rubber simply could not withstand the combination of overloaded trucks, debris-covered roads, and endless miles. At one point, 27 truck companies went without any maintenance support for several days. On portions of the return route between Chartres and Saint-Lô, no vehicle maintenance support was available at all. Drivers whose trucks broke down had to either fix them themselves or abandon them by the roadside. Technical Sergeant James Rookard of Maple Heights, Ohio, was just 19 years old when he drove for the Red Ball Express. His first-hand accounts, recorded in interviews decades after the war, offer some of the most vivid and moving testimony of what the drivers endured. He recalled driving when he could hardly see, operating just by instinct, sort of feeling the road beneath him through the vibrations of the steering wheel. He spoke honestly about the terror he experienced. There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. He was scared, but he did his job, hoping for the best. Being young and about 4,000 miles away from home, anybody would be scared. On the demands that General Patton placed on the truckers, Rookard was absolutely clear. When General Patton said for you to be there, you were there if you had to drive all day and all night. There was no negotiating, no excuses accepted. If those trucks broke down, Rookard and his fellow drivers fixed them and they ran again. The mission had to be completed regardless of what it cost the men performing it. Rookard also remembered that despite everything, the French people treated African Americans nice. It was a small comfort in the midst of exhaustion and danger, but it mattered. Technical Sergeant Emmanuel Wilson Green of Virginia served in the 3989th Motor Transport Company as an automotive mechanic for 2 years, 10 months, and 22 days. All but 10 months of that service was spent in the European theatre. It was the first time Green had ever left his home state. The young man from rural Virginia found himself stepping over dead enemy soldiers at forward supply points, working on damaged trucks under threat of sniper fire, and learning to survive in a world nothing had prepared him for. He named his oldest son after a non-commissioned officer in his company who was severely injured when he triggered a landmine near a truck that Green was repairing. After the war, Green made a promise to himself. He would never leave home again. In the 35 years that followed, he kept that promise. First Sergeant Levada Hall of the 3715th Quartermaster Truck Company came from Cleveland, Ohio. Decades after the war, he told his grandson Benjamin stories that had haunted him for a lifetime. Black drivers were deliberately sent into areas suspected to have enemy soldiers, he said, because the lives of black soldiers were not considered as important as the lives of white soldiers. If a route was dangerous, if a supply point was under threat, black trucking units were sent first. Hall witnessed a fellow soldier trigger a landmine during a rest stop along the route. The man was simply walking past him, while Hall sat on the truck's bumper eating his K ration. One moment, there was a man. The next moment, there was an explosion. Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company spoke plainly and without embellishment about the reality of serving in a segregated army. You accepted discrimination because you had no choice. Black soldiers were warned not to fraternize with white soldiers for fear that problems would arise. Staying in your place was a survival strategy. Making waves got you singled out for punishment or dangerous assignments. Perhaps no Red Ball veteran went on to greater historical significance than a young man named Medgar Evers. The future civil rights icon served in the Quartermaster Corps as part of the Red Ball Express at just 19 years of age. As a young soldier pushing through France in 1944, Evers spent time with a French family that welcomed him into their home. According to historian Matthew Delmont, who has extensively researched black soldiers in World War II, it was the first time Evers had ever been treated as a full human being by white people. The experience transformed him. After returning from the war, he told his brother Charles that when they got out of the army, they were going to straighten this thing out back home. Evers did exactly that. He became the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi. He led voter registration drives across the state, despite constant death threats. He fought for civil rights with the same determination he had shown driving trucks through France. On June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers was assassinated in his own driveway, shot in the back by a white supremacist. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The contrast between how black soldiers were treated in France and how they were treated at home, remains one of the most powerful and painful elements of their story. French civilians treated African American soldiers with remarkable warmth, dignity, and simple human respect. A soldier of the 93rd Division wrote home that these French people did not bother with any color line business. They treated black soldiers so well that the only time he ever knew he was colored was when he looked in a mirror. French families invited black soldiers into their homes for meals. French shopkeepers served them with courtesy. French citizens treated them as liberators, as heroes, as men. For soldiers who had grown up under American segregation, who had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, who had been denied access to restaurants and theaters and schools and basic human dignity, the French response was overwhelming. The United States Army actively tried to prevent this fraternization. During World War I, the Army had distributed a document titled Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops to French military and civilian officials. The document warned that French friendliness toward black soldiers was offensive to white Americans and should be discouraged. The French Parliament sharply rejected this attempt to export American racism. In World War II, the same dynamics played out again. White American soldiers spread rumors among French civilians that black soldiers had tails, that they were dangerous criminals, that they carried diseases. Black soldiers were confined to certain streets in many French towns. They were forbidden from speaking to French women under threat of military punishment. In some documented cases, black soldiers were shot by American military police for the crime of associating with French women who had willingly sought out their company. Now let us examine what the Red Ball Express actually accomplished in concrete terms. The operation delivered a verified total of 412,193 tons of supplies. Some sources cite figures as high as 500,000 tons, but this may include the contributions of sister operations that followed the Red Ball model. Peak daily throughput reached 12,342 tons on August 29, 1944, the single busiest day of the operation. At that point, all 132 truck companies and nearly 6,000 vehicles were operating simultaneously at maximum capacity. Over the course of the operation, drivers delivered more than 700,000 different items to troops in the European theatre. The Red Ball Express supplied 28 different divisions, keeping them fed, armed, fueled, and fighting. But the operation's own fuel consumption was staggering. Running thousands of trucks around the clock consumed roughly 300,000 gallons of fuel per day. This was nearly as much as a field army used in active combat. It created a painful paradox where the supply line consumed a significant portion of the very resources it was delivering. For every gallon of gasoline that reached Patton's tanks, a portion of another gallon had been burned getting it there. This inefficiency was understood from the beginning, but there was simply no alternative available in the time required. Specific casualty figures for the Red Ball Express are not well documented in surviving official records. This gap in the historical record itself reflects how black service troops and their sacrifices were undervalued by the military establishment of that era. Combat deaths were carefully counted and honored. Service troop deaths often went unrecorded or were buried in paperwork that no one thought important enough to preserve. Historical sources confirm that scores of black drivers and assistant drivers were killed or injured by enemy fire, landmines, aerial attack, and accidents. Drivers died from exhaustion when they fell asleep at the wheel and crashed. Drivers died from mines that exploded beneath their trucks. Drivers died from strafing runs and sniper fire. Drivers died from accidents caused by overloaded vehicles and deteriorating roads. No authoritative total casualty figure has ever been established, but the deaths were real and numerous. The military impact of the Red Ball Express cannot be overstated. Without it, the Allied advance would have stopped. Colonel John S.D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and himself a respected military historian, stated this conclusion unequivocally in his writings. Without the Red Ball Express, the advance across France could not have been made. He went further, noting that the spectacular nature of the advance was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. The glory went to the tank crews. The work was done by the truckers. General Eisenhower himself, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, sent an official message to Red Ball personnel in October 1944. He called the Red Ball line the lifeline between combat and supply. He said that to it fell the tremendous task of getting vital supplies from ports and depots to combat troops when and where such supplies were needed. He acknowledged that the armies depended on material without which they might fail. General Patton, a man never known for excessive praise or gratitude, concluded simply that the 2.5-ton truck was the most valuable weapon in the Allied arsenal. It was an extraordinary statement from a tank commander who worshipped armoured warfare, but Patton understood logistics. He knew that the mightiest tank in the world was useless without fuel to run it and ammunition to fire it. Time magazine, covering the war for American readers, called the Red Ball Express part of what it termed the miracle of supply. The magazine declared that this miracle was begotten of a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking chains. It was a peculiarly American achievement. An unnamed 5th Armored Division tank driver offered perhaps the most direct and honest testimony of what the Red Ball Express meant to the men who depended on it. He said that if it were not for the Red Ball, they could not have moved. The trucks came day and night, driven almost entirely by black soldiers. They delivered in the heat of combat. The tank crews would be sitting in their vehicles, watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty, praying for the trucks to come up and save them. An armoured division commander admitted that he would not want the trucker's job. The men who drove those trucks had what it took. Even after the Red Ball Express formally ended on November 16, 1944, its trucks and drivers played a decisive role in one of the most critical moments of the war. When the Germans launched their desperate counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, the attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, hundreds of former Red Ball trucks were immediately mobilized for emergency duty. They evacuated vast fuel stores from Belgian supply dumps before those critical reserves could fall into German hands. They carried the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division to Werbermont and the legendary 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne. Those rapid deployments by truck helped establish the defensive positions that would ultimately hold against the German offensive and turn the tide of battle. The Red Ball Express came to its official end for several practical reasons that converged in mid-November. The port of Antwerp, the largest port in Europe, had been captured by British forces on September 4th. But the Germans had continued to control the Scheldt estuary, the water approach to the port, preventing any ships from reaching its docks. After a bitter month-long campaign by British and Canadian forces, the estuary was finally cleared, and Antwerp began receiving ships on November 28, 1944. This provided a major deep-water port much closer to the front lines, drastically reducing the distance supplies needed to travel. Meanwhile, French railroad lines were being steadily repaired by army engineers and French workers. Portable 6-inch gasoline pipelines related to the cross-channel Pluto system were being laid across France to move fuel without trucks. The Red Ball's own truck fleet was also deteriorating rapidly under the strain of constant operation. Severe overloading had destroyed suspensions and transmissions. Tire shortages left vehicles sitting idle. Part scarcity meant that more trucks were being cannibalized for spare parts than were being returned to service. By mid-November, only 5 of the original 132 truck companies remained actively assigned to Red Ball routes. The return home for black veterans after the war ended was devastating. They had served their country with distinction. They had helped win the war in Europe and the Pacific. They had proven their courage and capability beyond any reasonable doubt, and none of it mattered to the racists who greeted them when they returned to American soil. Sergeant Isaac Woodard was a decorated black veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater with the 429th Port Battalion. Still wearing his Army uniform, he boarded a Greyhound bus in Georgia on February 12, 1946. He was heading home to North Carolina after receiving his honorable discharge just hours earlier. When the bus stopped in Batesburg, South Carolina, Woodard was removed from the bus after a dispute with the driver over using a restroom. Police Chief Linwood Shull took Woodard to an alley behind the jail and beat him savagely with a blackjack. Then Shull gouged out both of Woodard's eyes with the end of his nightstick, leaving the young veteran permanently blind. Woodard was charged with disorderly conduct and spent the night in jail before anyone provided medical attention for his destroyed eyes. When Shull was eventually brought to trial, an all-white jury acquitted him in under 30 minutes. The courtroom audience applauded the verdict. At least a dozen black veterans were killed or attacked upon returning home to America in 1946 alone. Some were murdered while still wearing the uniforms they had served in. They had survived the war, only to be killed by their own countrymen for the crime of expecting to be treated as citizens. The GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, was theoretically race-neutral in its language. It promised all veterans access to education benefits, home loans, and employment assistance. But the bill was administered by individual states at the insistence of Mississippi Representative John Rankin, a virulent segregationist who made certain that Southern states could deny these benefits to black veterans. In 13 Mississippi cities surveyed after the war, only 2 of 3,200 Veterans Administration-backed home loans went to black borrowers. Only 12% of black veterans were able to attend college using the GI Bill, compared to 28% of white veterans. 90% of those black veterans who did receive educational benefits were channeled to underfunded historically black colleges that could not provide the same opportunities as white universities. The Red Ball Express has suffered what can only be called a dual erasure from American memory. It was overlooked as a logistics operation because combat narratives dominated how World War II was remembered and taught. Americans wanted to hear about tank battles and beach landings and heroic last stands, not about truck drivers hauling supplies. And it was overlooked as a story of black service because the segregated era that created it also systematically minimized and erased African American contributions to the war effort. No African American serviceman received the Medal of Honor during World War II despite numerous acts of extraordinary bravery. In 1997, President Bill Clinton finally awarded the medal to 7 black World War II veterans after an official Army investigation determined that qualified black soldiers had been deliberately denied the honor because of their race. The 1952 Universal Pictures film Red Ball Express, directed by Bud Boetticher and starring Jeff Chandler with Sidney Poitier in a supporting role, reversed the racial composition of the operation. The film centered white characters and told a white story, despite the overwhelming black participation in the real operation. Director Boetticher later admitted the reason for this inversion. The Army would not let them tell the truth about the black troops because the government figured they were expendable. The 1973 CBS sitcom Rollout, created by the same team that produced the television series MASH, attempted to correct the historical record by featuring a predominantly black cast telling Red Ball stories. The show was cancelled after just 1 season. The first full-length book about the Red Ball Express did not appear until the year 2000, more than half a century after the operation ended. David P. Colley's The Road to Victory, The Untold Story of Race and World War II's Red Ball Express, finally brought scholarly attention to the story and the men who lived it. Lieutenant Colonel Shelton Ivan Ware served in the 3,420th Ordnance Medium Automotive Maintenance Company as a weapons and vehicle maintenance technician. Born January 29, 1923, in Neptune, New Jersey, he landed on Omaha Beach on July 3, 1944. After the war, Ware used his GI Bill benefits at Howard University, where he graduated cum laude. In July 1948, he was commissioned as a United States Air Force officer and reported to Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. and the 332nd Fighter Wing, becoming one of the documented original Tuskegee Airmen. He retired as a lieutenant colonel after 30 years of military service and went on to earn a Doctor of Public Administration degree from the University of Southern California. Looking back on his service, Ware captured the dual burden that black soldiers carried with clarity that has never been surpassed. "We fought 2 wars," he said. "You had to fight the war of segregation, and you also had to do your duty as far as the enemy was concerned." Lieutenant Colonel Ware died on September 12, 2024, at the age of 101. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extends far beyond military logistics. Roughly 1/3 of the leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement were World War II veterans: Medgar Evers, Hosea Williams, Amzie Moore. These men and countless others returned from Europe determined to claim the freedom they had fought to defend. They had liberated France. They had helped defeat fascism. They had proven that black Americans could serve with courage and distinction, and they were not willing to accept second-class citizenship in the country they had saved. Executive Order 9981, signed by President Harry S. Truman on July 26, 1948, officially desegregated the armed forces of the United States. The order was a direct consequence of black wartime service and the moral impossibility of maintaining segregation after black soldiers had done so much to win the war. It was also a response to the violence that black veterans faced upon returning home, violence that shocked the conscience of the nation and the world. The Red Ball Express is not merely a logistics story, though it is certainly that. It is a story about who builds nations and who receives credit for building them. Thousands of black soldiers drove through minefields and strafing runs and 54-hour shifts of sleepless exhaustion to deliver the fuel and ammunition that liberated Western Europe. They came home to a country that blinded them, lynched them, and denied them the benefits they had earned with their service and their blood. From August to November 1944, the Red Ball Express directly enabled every major Allied advance and contributed critically to the defense that stopped the German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. Generals praised the truckers. Time magazine called their work a miracle. Tank crews who sat watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty knew exactly who to thank when the supplies finally arrived. The soldiers who delivered those supplies earned no medals, received no parades, and came home to a country that refused to acknowledge what they had done. They were fathers and sons, brothers and husbands. They drove through the night because they believed that if they proved their worth, if they demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that black Americans were capable of courage and dedication and sacrifice, their country might finally see them as equals. They were wrong about that. America did not repay their service with justice. But they drove anyway. Today, the last of the Red Ball Express veterans have passed into history. Lieutenant Colonel Ware, who died in 2024 at 101, was among the final survivors. The task of remembering now belongs entirely to those who came after. Their sacrifice was real. Their contribution was decisive. Their story demands to be told. Lieutenant Colonel Ware left a message that belongs at the very heart of this story. He said that all war is stupid. Avoid it at all costs, and you come out ahead. But when his country called, he answered. They all answered. The black soldiers, who made up 3/4 of the Red Ball Express, drove through hell for a nation that did not love them back. That is the legacy of the Red Ball Express, and that is why their story must never be forgotten.